go ahead and have Rich start it up. Rich, you want to go ahead?
The Hemi, arguably the most legendary engine name in American history. So dominant in NASCAR, they banned it from competition. And Chrysler, the company that built it, decided to kill it themselves. The reason goes deeper than you think. To understand why losing the Hemi hurts so much, you need to understand what the name actually means, not just as an engine, as a legacy. 1951, Chrysler introduces the Firepower V8, 331 cubic inches, 180 horsepower. Those numbers don't sound like much now, but the design underneath them was genuinely ahead of its time. The hemispherical combustion chamber. That's where the name comes from. Instead of a flat or wedge-shaped chamber, the Hemi used a dome-shaped design that let the intake and exhaust valves sit on opposite sides at an angle. More room for bigger valves. Better airflow, more complete combustion. It was inherently more efficient than what everybody else was building. Cadillac and Oldsmobile had just launched their own overhead valve V8s, and Chrysler showed up with something fundamentally better. But the real legend started in 1964. The 426 Hemi, 425 horsepower, 490 pound-feet of torque. Chrysler brought it to the Daytona 500 that year, and what happened wasn't a race. It was an execution. Chrysler cars swept the top 4 positions. Richard Petty won by a full lap. NASCAR's response was to ban the engine entirely for the 1965 season. That's how dominant it was. They literally changed the rules because of one engine. Chrysler boycotted NASCAR for most of that year, came back in 1966, and the Hemi kept winning. On the street, the 426 became the most feared engine in the muscle car era. It showed up in the Plymouth Barracuda, the Dodge Charger, the Challenger. If you saw Hemi on the fender, you knew what was coming, or more accurately, you knew what was leaving you behind. Then it died. The first time. 1971. New emissions regulations, skyrocketing insurance rates for high-performance cars. The muscle car market collapsed almost overnight. Chrysler pulled the 426 Hemi from production. It wasn't just Chrysler. Everybody was cutting horsepower. But losing the Hemi felt different. It felt like the end of something. And for over 30 years, it was. The Hemi name sat dormant. Chrysler went through mergers, near bankruptcies, ownership changes. The company that had built the most feared engine in American racing history was building minivans. Good minivans, sure, but still. Then came 2003. Chrysler resurrected the Hemi. The new 5.7-liter V8 debuted in the Dodge Ram pickup, 345 horsepower, 375 pound-feet of torque. It had a clever feature called multi-displacement system that could shut down 4 of its 8 cylinders during light cruising to save fuel. It wasn't the fire-breathing monster of the 60s. It didn't need to be. What it needed to be was a statement. The Hemi is back. And it worked. The 5.7 became a massive commercial hit. Truck buyers wanted it. Charger buyers wanted it. Chrysler had found something that connected the brand's past to its present in a way that actually sold vehicles. From there, the Hemi family grew. The 6.4-liter 392 arrived with 485 horsepower, slotting into the Challenger and Charger Scat Packs. Then came the one that broke everything wide open, the supercharged 6.2-liter Hellcat. 707 horsepower, from the factory, in a sedan. The Hellcat didn't just revive Dodge's performance image, it became the entire identity. The Hellcat, the Demon, the Superstock, the jailbreak editions. Dodge built its whole brand around variations of the Hemi platform. Every special edition, every social media moment, every burnout video that went viral, all of it traced back to that hemispherical combustion chamber concept from 1951. The Hemi wasn't just an engine. It was a cultural institution. Your grandfather knew the name, your father knew the sound. 3 generations of American car culture, all connected by those 4 letters. So the Hemi was more than engineering, it was identity, which makes what happened next even harder to understand. Here's the part nobody wants to hear. The Hemi didn't die because Chrysler wanted it dead. It died because the math made it impossible to keep alive. To understand why, you need to understand a thing called CAFE, Corporate Average Fuel Economy. It's a federal standard that's been around since the 1970s, and it basically says that every automaker's fleet of vehicles, averaged together, has to hit a certain fuel economy number, not each individual car, the average across everything you sell. For decades, this wasn't a huge problem for Chrysler. The standards crept up slowly, and you could offset your thirsty V8s with a few economy cars and some creative math. But starting around 2012, the target started climbing, fast. By 2025, the requirement was pushing toward roughly 40 miles per gallon as a fleet average. Think about that for a second. 40 miles per gallon, averaged across every single vehicle a company sells. Now think about what Chrysler was selling. Ram trucks, Dodge Chargers, Dodge Challengers, Jeep Grand Cherokees with Hemi 5.8s. The 6.2-liter supercharged Hellcat engine, their crown jewel, the thing that made enthusiasts lose their minds, produced roughly 700 horsepower. It returned about 13 miles per gallon in the city. 13. You'd need to sell a whole lot of hybrids to offset that kind of number in your fleet average. And it wasn't just the Hellcat. The standard 5.7-liter Hemi wasn't exactly sipping fuel either. Across the board, Chrysler's lineup was among the thirstiest in the entire industry. They were consistently near the bottom of fleet fuel economy rankings. Dead last some years. So what happens when you can't meet the standards? You pay fines, you buy credits. And this is where it gets really ugly. In 2021, Fiat Chrysler merged with PSA Group, the French company behind Peugeot and Citroën, to form Stellantis. This was supposed to help with the emissions problem because PSA had a bunch of small, efficient European cars that could theoretically balance out all those American V8s in the global fleet numbers. But it didn't work out that cleanly. The European Union had its own emissions regulations, and they were even more aggressive than the American ones. Stellantis was getting hit from both sides. In the U.S., they were paying CAFE fines. In Europe, they were facing penalties for exceeding carbon dioxide emissions targets. The combined bill was staggering. In 2021 alone, the compliance costs ran into the billions. Fiat Chrysler had been paying roughly 2 billion euros in EU emissions fines and credit purchases. And here's the part that really stings for Hemi fans. A significant chunk of those regulatory credits were being purchased from Tesla. Yes. Every time someone bought a Hellcat, part of the hidden cost of that transaction was essentially a payment to Elon Musk's company. The Dodge lineup was being subsidized by regulatory penalties. Every Hellcat sold was costing Stellantis far more than the sticker price when you factored in the compliance math. The accountants could see where this was heading, and it was heading somewhere bad. On top of the federal standards, individual states started making their own moves. California announced plans to ban the sale of new internal combustion engine vehicles by 2035. New York followed, then Washington, Oregon, Massachusetts, and others. By the time you added them all up, these states represented a massive portion of the new car market in America. You simply could not ignore them. So the math looked like this: tightening federal standards requiring fleet averages that a V8 heavy lineup couldn't achieve. Billions in annual fines and credit purchases bleeding the balance sheet. State-level bans on the horizon that would literally make it illegal to sell these engines in major markets. And a European parent company that had its own emissions crisis to deal with. The Hemi wasn't just expensive to build, it was expensive to exist. Every unit produced made the compliance problem worse. Every one sold deepened the financial hole. The engine itself was fine, more than fine. It was one of the best V8s ever made. But the regulatory environment had turned it into a liability on a spreadsheet. But regulations alone didn't kill the Hemi. What actually pulled the trigger was a corporate decision made an ocean away from Detroit. January 2021. Fiat Chrysler merges with PSA Group, the French conglomerate behind Peugeot and Citroën. The new company is called Stellantis, and the man put in charge is Carlos Tavares. Now, Tavares had a reputation. At PSA, he'd taken a company that was bleeding money and turned it profitable in about 3 years. How? He cut everything: redundant platforms, underperforming models, anything that didn't justify its existence on a spreadsheet. The European auto press called him a turnaround genius. The people whose jobs disappeared called him other things. But the numbers worked, and that's what mattered to the board. So here's this guy, a Portuguese-born executive who spent his entire career in European auto manufacturing, suddenly overseeing Dodge, Ram, Jeep, and Chrysler. Brands built on big engines, big trucks, and a customer base that genuinely does not care about fuel economy. Tavares looked at the Hemi and saw a liability. Dodge enthusiasts looked at it and saw their identity. Guess who won? In March of 2022, Stellantis unveiled the Dare Forward 2030 strategic plan. The headline commitment was aggressive: 100% battery electric vehicle sales in Europe by 2030, 50% in the United States by the same date. Every brand under the Stellantis umbrella would transition. No exceptions: not Fiat, not Maserati, not Dodge. The thing is, Tavares wasn't wrong about the direction of the industry. Regulations were tightening globally. The EPA was pushing harder on fleet emission standards. Europe was moving toward outright bans on internal combustion sales. Every major automaker was making similar announcements, but most of them were hedging, saying things like up to 50% electric or targeting certain numbers. Tavares committed: hard dates, hard numbers, and the Hemi was on the wrong side of every single one of them. Dodge announced that 2023 would be the final model year for the Hemi-powered Charger and Challenger. After decades of production, the curtain was coming down, and Dodge, to their credit, decided to go out swinging. They launched 7 special editions under the banner Last Call, each one a tribute to a different chapter of Dodge muscle car history: the Challenger Shakedown, the Charger King Daytona, the Challenger Swinger. Names pulled straight from the Heritage Vault, each limited in production, each designed to give enthusiasts one last reason to write a very large check. But the real headline was the final model: the Dodge Challenger SRT Demon 170. This thing was not a subtle farewell: 1,025 horsepower on E85 fuel, 0 to 60 in 1.66 seconds, according to Dodge, quarter mile in under 9 seconds, from the factory, on street-legal tires. It was the most powerful muscle car ever produced by an American manufacturer, the most powerful Hemi ever built, and it was specifically designed to be the last one. Dodge built it as a send-off, a middle finger and a love letter rolled into one. The name itself was a statement. 170 referred to the top speed, 170 miles per hour, which they'd actually limited electronically. Without the limiter, who knows? The point wasn't top speed anyway. The point was the quarter mile. The point was violence in a straight line. One last time. Dealers couldn't keep them on lots. Markups were obscene. The very last Demon 170 to roll off the line at the Brampton Assembly Plant in Ontario sold at Barrett-Jackson auction for over $500,000. A production car, $500,000. The community response was exactly what you'd expect. Forums lit up. Social media was a mix of grief and rage. People who'd grown up with these cars, who'd built their weekends around drag strips and car meets, watched the corporate press releases and felt something real slipping away. This wasn't just a model being discontinued. This was a culture being told its time was up. And Tavares, for his part, seemed genuinely unbothered. In interviews, he talked about electrification as inevitable. about the need to move forward, about how electric Dodges would still deliver performance. The enthusiasts heard the words. They just didn't believe them. So the corporate decision was made. The last Hemis rolled off the line. The factories went quiet. But to really understand what was lost, you need to understand what the Hemi actually was under the skin. So that happened. If you're enjoying the ride, hit subscribe. Plenty more where this came from. Now, let's talk about what actually made a Hemi, because the name gets thrown around a lot, and most people couldn't tell you why it mattered. The answer starts with geometry. A hemispherical combustion chamber. That's it. That's the secret. The top of the cylinder, where the fuel and air ignite, is shaped like a dome, half a sphere. And that shape changes everything about how an engine breathes. In a flathead or wedge design, the valves sit more or less parallel to each other or at a shallow angle. That limits how big you can make them. And valve size directly controls airflow. More air in, more fuel burned, more power out. Simple as that. The hemispherical design lets you angle the valves outward, opposing each other across the dome. The original 426 Hemi had valve, included angles of roughly 58.5 degrees. That meant massive valves, massive airflow. The kind of breathing that wedge-head engines couldn't touch no matter how hard engineers tried. The combustion was more efficient, too. That dome shape promotes a more complete burn of the fuel-air mixture, and the spark plug sits right at the top of the dome where it can ignite everything evenly, less wasted fuel, more energy pushing the piston down. It's elegant, honestly. Now here's the thing. The modern Hemi, the one that went into millions of trucks and Chargers and Challengers starting in 2003, wasn't technically a true hemispherical chamber anymore. Engineers redesigned it with a modified shape, closer to what they internally called a polyspherical chamber. They even ran 2 spark plugs per cylinder for better combustion coverage. But marketing called it a Hemi, because the name sold trucks, and honestly the performance backed it up, so nobody complained. The 5.7-liter Hemi became the workhorse. 345 horsepower in most applications with cylinder deactivation through the multi-displacement system. During light cruising, the engine would shut down 4 of its 8 cylinders. You'd be rolling down the highway in a 5,000-pound truck and half the engine was basically asleep. When you hit the gas, all 8 came back online instantly. It was Chrysler's answer to fuel economy regulations without giving up the V8 entirely. Then there was the 6.4-liter 392, 485 horsepower, naturally aspirated. No turbo, no supercharger, just displacement and engineering. That engine holds a distinction that matters more now than it did then. It was the last naturally aspirated big-bore V8 in mass production, the last of a breed that stretches back decades. When it's gone, it's gone. But the crown jewel, the one that broke people's brains, the Hellcat, 6.2 liters, supercharged, 707 horsepower from the factory, with a warranty. That last part is the part that doesn't make sense. Dodge engineers took a cast iron block, filled it with forged steel connecting rods and forged pistons, and then bolted an IHI supercharger on top that displaced 2.4 liters all by itself. That supercharger spun at 13,000 RPM and crammed 11.6 psi of boost into those hemispherical chambers, 13,000 RPM, on a blower. The whine alone became iconic. People could identify a Hellcat by sound before they ever saw it. The engineering challenge wasn't just making 700 horsepower. Any tuner shop can do that on a dyno for an afternoon. The challenge was making 700 horsepower that a regular person could drive to work every day for 5 years without the engine grenading itself. That meant managing heat, managing detonation, managing the stress on every rotating component at sustained high loads. The cooling system alone was a project. Dodge used a dedicated low-temperature circuit just for the supercharger's intercooler separate from the engine's main cooling loop. And they pulled it off. Hellcat engines were remarkably reliable for what they were. People daily drove them. People put 100,000 miles on them, 700 horsepower, factory warranty, pump gas. That combination had never existed before. The Hemi name started as pure engineering. By the end, it was part engineering, part marketing. The chambers weren't even truly hemispherical anymore, but the performance was absolutely real. So the engineering was genuinely impressive, which makes what replaced it all the more controversial. So what replaces a legend? Chrysler's answer was actually two answers, and neither one made everybody happy. The first replacement is the Hurricane, a 3.0-liter twin-turbocharged inline-six. Now, if you just felt something twist in your gut reading that, you're not alone. An inline-six, replacing a V8 in a Dodge. The engineers at Stellantis knew exactly how that would land, so they made sure the numbers were impossible to argue with. The Hurricane comes in two flavors. The standard output version makes 420 horsepower. The high output version pushes 510 horsepower, from 3 liters. For context, the old 5.7 Hemi made 376 horsepower from nearly twice the displacement. The 6.4 made 485. So the high output Hurricane actually beats both of them, and it does it while burning roughly 15 to 20% less fuel. The torque curves tell an even more interesting story. Because of those twin turbochargers, the Hurricane delivers peak torque much lower in the rev range than the naturally aspirated Hemis ever could. That means in real-world driving, not just on a dyno sheet, the Hurricane feels stronger in the situations most people actually use. Merging onto a highway, pulling away from a stoplight, towing. The power is there sooner, and it stays there longer. On paper, this engine is a home run. It's lighter than the Hemi, it's more efficient, it makes more power. It meets emission standards that the Hemi never could. The engineering team designed this thing from scratch specifically to be the V8 killer. And technically, they succeeded. But it doesn't have 8 cylinders, and it doesn't say Hemi on the valve covers. And for a lot of people, that's the whole point. Now, the second replacement, this is where things got really interesting. In 2022, Dodge revealed the Charger Daytona concept, fully electric. This was supposed to be the future of American muscle. CEO Tim Kuniskis stood on stage at the reveal event, and he knew the room was skeptical. An electric Charger, no engine at all. So Dodge had a trick up their sleeve. They called it the Fratsonic Chambered Exhaust. Here's what that is. It's an amplifier connected to a tuning chamber mounted at the rear of the car. It takes sound and pushes it through a physical resonance chamber to create an exhaust note at up to 126 decibels. That's louder than most V8s. It's louder than a rock concert. There's just one problem. It's not real. The sound doesn't come from combustion. It doesn't come from exhaust gases flowing through headers and mufflers. It comes from speakers and a tuning chamber. It's engineered noise. And when Kuniskis played that sound on stage, the internet lost its mind. The backlash was immediate and brutal. Forums lit up, comment sections turned toxic. A speaker-driven fake exhaust note on a car meant to replace the Hemi. For a huge portion of the Dodge faithful, this wasn't innovation. It was insult. It was like replacing a Stradivarius with a Bluetooth speaker playing violin sounds. Sure, it's technically music, but come on. The memes wrote themselves. People called it a glorified golf cart with a subwoofer. Dodge enthusiasts who had spent decades loyal to the brand felt genuinely betrayed. The Hemi wasn't just an engine to these people, it was an identity, and replacing it with synthesized sound felt like the company didn't understand its own customers. Now here's the thing, the electric Charger Daytona ended up getting delayed. When the 2025 Charger actually launched, it came with the Hurricane Inline 6 as its primary powertrain, not the electric version. The gas engine arrived first. The EV is still coming, but the timeline keeps shifting. So the car that was supposed to represent Dodge's electric future got pushed back, and the car that actually showed up has a six-cylinder where the V8 used to be. Neither outcome is what the faithful wanted. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The Hurricane is probably a better engine than the Hemi in almost every measurable way. More power per liter, better fuel economy, cleaner emissions, stronger low-end torque. By every objective metric, it's superior. But engines aren't just measurements. If they were, nobody would care about any of this. Nobody puts a poster of a fuel economy chart on their garage wall. Nobody tells their kids about the time they heard an inline six for the first time. The Hemi was never just about the numbers. It was about the feeling. And that's the one thing engineering can't replace on a spec sheet. So the replacements exist. Some are genuinely impressive. Some are deeply controversial. But the real consequences of killing the Hemi go beyond just swapping one engine for another. The moment Chrysler confirmed the Hemi was done, the used car market went sideways. Hemi-powered Challengers and Chargers that had been sitting on dealer lots at reasonable prices suddenly jumped 20 to 40% almost overnight. People who'd been on the fence about buying one weren't on the fence anymore. They were scrambling. The last call special editions, particularly the Demon 170, sold out instantly. Every single one, and now they're trading at massive premiums on the secondary market. A car that's stickered around $120,000 is commanding $200,000 or more, depending on the spec. Some are sitting in climate-controlled garages as investments. They'll never see a drag strip. That's what happens when you kill something people love. The last ones become artifacts. But the price spikes were just the surface. The deeper problem was what this did to Dodge as a brand. Think about it. For the better part of 2 decades, Dodge had rebuilt its entire identity around one thing: V8 muscle. The Hemi was in every commercial, every tagline, every piece of marketing. The brand wasn't selling transportation, it was selling a feeling. That rumble at idle, that shove in the back when you hit the gas. Take the Hemi away, and what exactly is Dodge? That's not a rhetorical question. It's one the company is still trying to answer. The Hornet is a rebadged Alfa Romeo crossover. The electric Charger Daytona is quick, but quick isn't the same thing as visceral. Dodge went from being the brand that built the Hellcat to the brand searching for a personality. That transition has been rough, and Dodge wasn't alone in this. The whole American muscle car landscape collapsed in about 18 months. Chevrolet discontinued the Camaro, just stopped making it. No direct replacement announced. Ford kept the Mustang alive with a V8 option, making it the last one standing in the traditional muscle car triangle. 3 competitors that had been battling each other since the 1960s, and now only one still offers what started the fight in the first place. The muscle car era didn't fade out gradually. It fell off a cliff. Now, behind all of this was Stellantis, and Stellantis was not having a good time. 2024 was brutal for the company. Sales fell across multiple brands. Inventory piled up on dealer lots. The stock price dropped significantly. And Carlos Tavares, the CEO who had orchestrated the Hemi's discontinuation as part of his electrification strategy, departed the company in December of 2024. The man who killed the Hemi didn't even stick around to see what replaced it. The board cited differences over how to handle the company's declining performance. So the architect of this entire transition was gone, and the transition itself was only half finished. Not exactly a confidence builder. Then there's Brampton. The Brampton assembly plant in Ontario had been building Chargers and Challengers for decades. At its peak, roughly 3,500 workers clocked in there every day. When the last Hemi-powered Challenger rolled off the line on December 22, 2023, workers signed the underside of the hood. Some of those workers had been there 30 years. Their fathers had worked the same line before them. The plant was supposed to retool for electric vehicle production. That was the plan. That was the promise. As of late 2024, it sat largely idle. Stellantis kept pushing timelines back, kept revising projections. 3,500 families waiting for answers that kept not coming. This is the part that doesn't show up in corporate press releases. Killing the Hemi wasn't just an engineering decision or a regulatory compliance move. It was a cultural one. It affected the guy who saved up for 3 years to buy a Scat Pack. It affected the dealership mechanic who specialized in Hemi rebuilds. It affected an entire community in Ontario that depended on one factory building one kind of car. The ripple effects spread outward in ways that quarterly earnings reports don't capture. And the cost is still being calculated. Stellantis is still figuring out what Dodge is supposed to be. Dealers are still figuring out how to sell electric muscle to customers who came in wanting 8 cylinders and a cam upgrade. The used market is still adjusting. Nothing has settled yet. So where does that leave the Hemi's legacy? And does the name have any future at all? So here's the thing about the Hemi. It stopped being just an engine a long time ago. It became a symbol, a shorthand for an entire philosophy of American engineering where the answer to every question was more cubic inches, more horsepower, more noise, more everything. And that philosophy, whether you loved it or thought it was reckless, defined an era. The Hemi was the last engine standing from that era. Now it's gone. And people know it. There are Demon 170 owners who took delivery of their cars and immediately sealed them in climate-controlled storage. Never started, never driven, not once. They rolled them off the trailer, put a cover on them, and locked the garage. Preserved like time capsules of a moment that just ended. In 20 years, maybe less, these will be what the original 426 Hemi cars are today. 6-figure machines, maybe 7 figures. Artifacts from the last time a major American automaker looked at the regulations closing in from every direction and said, you know what? Let's build the most powerful thing we possibly can before the door shuts. That's what these cars represent, not just performance, defiance. Now, is the Hemi name truly dead forever? Maybe not. Stellantis has dropped hints that the name could return on a future electric or hybrid performance powertrain. And honestly, that makes sense from a marketing perspective. The name carries weight, it sells. But slapping the Hemi badge on an electric motor would be like calling a synthesizer a Stradivarius. Technically, you can do it. The question is whether anyone buys the connection. The V8 itself isn't completely extinct globally. There are still manufacturers building them for specific applications. But its role as a mainstream passenger car engine is effectively over. The math just doesn't work anymore. Emission standards, fuel economy requirements, electrification mandates. The V8 lost the war of attrition against regulation, not because it couldn't perform, because the world decided performance had to be measured differently. And this mirrors transitions we've seen before. The end of leaded fuel, the death of the carburetor, the slow disappearance of manual transmissions from everything except sports cars and trucks. Each time, people said they don't make them like they used to. Each time, they were right. And each time, the world moved on anyway. Progress doesn't care about nostalgia. It never has. But nostalgia has its own power. Every generation gets a "they don't make them like this anymore" moment. For the generation that grew up hearing a 5.7 or a 6.4 Hemi idle at a stoplight, this is that moment. The sound, the vibration, the completely unnecessary excess of it all. That's what's being lost. Not just an engine configuration, a sensory experience that electric motors, for all their torque and efficiency, simply cannot replicate. Silence is impressive. But it's not the same thing. The Hemi lasted in one form or another for over 70 years, from the firepower in 1951 to the Demon 170 in 2023. That's a run most engine families never come close to matching. And that brings us back to where we started. So let's come back to where we started. Chrysler didn't kill the Hemi because people stopped buying them. Demand was never the problem. The order books were full right up to the end. They killed it because the math stopped working. Global emissions regulations, Stellantis corporate restructuring, and the irreversible momentum toward electrification made it financially impossible to justify keeping a supercharged 6.2-liter V8 on life support. The accountants won. They always do. And look, you can argue about whether that was the right call. Plenty of people will. But the decision wasn't really about one engine. It was about an entire era closing out. The Hemi was the last of a breed, the last time a major automaker looked at a motor and said, yeah, let's make it bigger, louder, and more ridiculous, and then actually did it. Not as a limited run, not as a special edition. As a production option you could order on a Tuesday. The last Hemi ever produced made over 1,000 horsepower. The first one, back in 1951, made 180. 72 years of development. From a Chrysler New Yorker luxury sedan to a drag strip weapon that could embarrass supercars costing 10 times as much. That's the Hemi's real story, not how it died, how it lived. And the thing is, the Hemi's real legacy was never about the hemispherical combustion chamber. Not really. It was about what that engine represented. American engineering excess at its most unapologetic. The idea that more is more, that horsepower solves most problems, and that the sound an engine makes matters just as much as the numbers it puts down. That philosophy is harder to find now. Maybe impossible. The engines are going quiet. That part's done. But 72 years of shaking the ground doesn't just disappear. If you owned a Hemi, worked on one, or just loved the sound of one at a stoplight, drop your story in the comments. Genuinely want to hear it. And if you made it this far, subscribe. We've got more stories like this coming. Engines, engineering, the things we built and the reasons we stopped building them.